Around 140 AD, a group of Jewish rabbis went about the task of rewriting the Greek Septuagint. They wrote a new Greek translation of the Old Testament and purposefully and intentionally edited out key passages of Scripture pertaining to the prophecies of Jesus and genealogies proving that he was the high priest and Messiah. Prior to this, the Greek Septuagint was the Old Testament Bible used by both Christians and Jews alike for over 300 years. The Septuagint was originally written by a group of Jews who translated the original Hebrew Bible into Greek. This was necessitated by the need for a Greek translation, as Hebrew was a dead language by that time, and most people in that region spoke a combination of Greek and Aramaic. So the question many people had at that time was why, after over 300 years, would the Jewish rabbis feel a need to retranslate the Greek Septuagint into Greek? After all, they thought, if their forefathers were satisfied with the Jewish authors' translations of the Septuagint, why couldn't they be? Well, the early Christians, for one, were not happy about this new translation and outright rejected it, as they could clearly see how they had left out certain prophecies of Jesus. And this new translation also caused many early church fathers to become divided over it. Some continued to use the Septuagint and spoke out against this new translation, while others began to reject the Septuagint in favor of the new translation. This new Greek version ended up being the one that the Masoretes used to translate the Old Testament into their fake Hebrew Masoretic text. How do I know this? Because the Masoretic text is the text that most of your Old Testament Bibles were translated from into the many English versions today. And what many people are discovering is that their Old Testament Bibles differ greatly from the Septuagint version. As I stated earlier, that is because our sneaky rabbi friends are the culprits. So, once again, why did they do it? Based on the key scriptural passages they chose to edit regarding the prophecies and genealogies of Jesus, the answer becomes clear. They hate Jesus and Christians and wanted to prove that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. This way, the hope was that it would stop any more Jews from converting to Christianity. You see, the Jews had just lost millions of their people to the Roman Jewish wars and revolts, and they didn't want to lose any more to Christianity. So their plan was hashed and executed. Now, a little information about our rabbi friends. The chief instigator behind this plot was a man named Rabbi Akiva. He is considered a national hero of the Jewish people for all time. And the Talmud actually puts him on the same pedestal as Moses. Did you know he had over 24,000 students? 3 of which are co-conspirators in this plot to undeify Jesus from the Septuagint. One of those students is named Aquila of Sinope. He was a pagan convert to Christianity, but was rebuked for his continuance of astrology practices. He got upset over that and denied Jesus and left Christianity for good to become a devout Jew. In the Talmud, he is known as Onkelos, who is quoted as saying that Jesus is a sinner in hell, boiling in semen and excrement. Yes, my brothers and sisters, these are the same rabbis that have hijacked your Old Testament Bibles with their Jesus-hating hearts. Are we surprised? After all, they claim to be proud descendants of the Pharisees. As I mentioned previously, this new Greek translation became the Masoretic text translation of the Old Testament, and there are many differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint versions. Before I move on, I also want to point out that this new Greek translation has been lost, as shown in this diagram here, just like the original Hebrew manuscripts have been lost. Now, back to the differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. First off, the Septuagint contains 62 books, many of which were quoted by early Christians, but are not found in the Masoretic text, as the Masoretic text contains only 39 books. That's right! The Jews decided to throw away 23 books that Jesus used, as well as his disciples and the early Christian church. They also deleted Psalm 151 entirely from the Septuagint. One of the books of the Septuagint, called the Book of Wisdom, was often quoted and highly regarded by early Christians. It is from this book that Paul got his armor of God imagery he used in Ephesians. This book also contains many messianic prophecies that are fulfilled in the New Testament. For example, a prophecy about Jesus as a young boy in the temple. The book of Sirach, also in the Septuagint, contains many of Jesus' teachings, including the Sermon on the Mount. And the Masoretic text version of the book of Esther is missing portions that are in the Septuagint. God is not mentioned at all in the Masoretic text version in that book, but he is mentioned in the Septuagint. And interactions between God, Mordecai, and Esther mentioned in the Septuagint are not mentioned at all in the Masoretic text. And if that's not enough, the Jews also tampered with the timelines and genealogies. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 of the Masoretic text, it says that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. The Septuagint says they were in Egypt and also the land of Canaan for 430 years. The Samaritan Pentateuch also agrees with the Septuagint in this regard. For the sake of time, there is a great video in the description below that goes into detail to explain why the Masoretic text is incorrect. Now, on to the corrupt genealogies. In the same video I just mentioned and shown here, the author goes into great detail about how the Jews also altered the patriarchs' genealogies in order to prove that Jesus was not the high priest. In Genesis chapter 11, verse 10, it shows a list of Noah's son Shem's descendants, all the way down to Abraham. In the Septuagint, all of the descendants' firstborn sons were born when they were over 100 years old. For example, in verse 12 it says, Arphaxad lived 135 years and begot Canaan. And in verse 13 it says, Canaan lived 130 years and begot Salah. This extra 100 years continues on down through the lines of descendants to Abraham. This is also the case in the Samaritan Pentateuch as well. However, in the Masoretic text, it says Arphaxad was only 35 years old when his son was born, and Canaan was only 30 years old when his son was born, and likewise down the line to Abraham. So, the Masoretic text has taken off an extra 100 years for each descendant. There are 7 descendants in total, which would mean 700 years have been taken off the genealogy timeline. And that's not all. The Masoretic text also has 1 generation entirely missing from the genealogy. In the Septuagint, it states that Arphaxad fathered Canaan, and Canaan fathered Salah. In the Masoretic text, it says Arphaxad fathered Salah, and Salah fathered Eber. There is no mention of Canaan at all, although Luke does include Canaan in his genealogy in that gospel. Why would they leave out Canaan? Was that a mistake, or was it intentional? Well, in the book of Jubilees, Canaan is mentioned. He sinned against God by learning the teachings of the Watchers and hiding them from Noah. So could this be why the rabbis chose to omit Canaan? Due to his sin? Or was it just a scribal error? The Masoretic text also states that Nahor was 29 years when he fathered Terah, Abraham's father. But the Septuagint states Nahor was 179 years old. So when you add all the missing years together, it comes out to 880 years. Creation scientists use the Old Testament Masoretic text to determine how old the earth truly is. Based on the genealogies and biblical events, they believe the earth is 6,000 years old. With this new info, the earth is actually closer to 7,000 years old. The rabbis intentionally deleted almost 1,000 years from our timeline. Incredible. And here's why. In the book of Hebrews, it says that Jesus is the new high priest. Psalm chapter 110 verse 4 states that he is a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is mentioned in Genesis. He was the king of Salem and priest of God who blessed Abraham. By taking off 100 years from each generation, the rabbis wanted to falsely show that Shem outlived all his descendants and was alive when Abraham was. They state that Shem is really Melchizedek, although there is no biblical proof of this at all. And if Shem is really Melchizedek, then the Levitical priesthood descended through him from Abraham down to Levi, who is Abraham's great-grandson. And if Melchizedek is part of the line of Levi, then Jesus could not have descended from him, because Jesus came from a different tribe, the tribe of Judah, thus proving that Jesus is not a high priest after all. Can you believe this? Deleting 880 years to attempt to prove Jesus was not a high priest of any order. And if that's not enough, they altered many other verses to show Jesus was not the Messiah. In this video, this author shows how the New Testament quotations by the disciples match the Septuagint and not the Masoretic text. For the sake of time, I will not go through each one, but instead highlight the ones pertaining to the prophecies of Jesus. Here is Luke chapter 4, verse 18. This is a quote from Isaiah chapter 6, D1, verses 1 and 2, regarding the prophecy of Jesus. Recovery of sight to the blind, shown here, is in the Septuagint below. However, it is missing here from the Masoretic text. I believe this is because the Jews did not want it known that Jesus could perform miracles, such as recovering sight to the blind, as this would be an indicator that he was the Son of God. Here in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 5, it says, "But you prepared a body for me," referring to Jesus' death and resurrection. This matches up with the Septuagint below, which says the same in this psalm. However, here in the Masoretic text, it says instead, "You open my ears to listen." Clearly, the rabbis were opposed to any reference to Jesus' resurrection, as that would once again prove that he is the Messiah. And also notice the beginnings of a pattern here. The New Testament quoters were all quoting directly from the Septuagint and not the Masoretic text, proving that they read from the Septuagint and not from the Masoretic text. John chapter 3, verse 16, shown here, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." Only begotten can also be found here in Psalm 22 of the Septuagint. However, it is missing here entirely from the Masoretic text, instead saying, "my only life." Those sneaky rabbis. The author of this video also shows a quote by Origen in 235 AD, who is one of the early church fathers. To summarize the quote, Origen states that the Jews intentionally removed from the Old Testament any scandal against the elders, rulers, and judges, as well as any hint that they were responsible for the murders of God's prophets. He references Jesus, who spoke about the prophet Zechariah slain between the temple and the altar, stating that we learn this only from Jesus, not knowing it otherwise from Scripture. Also, Stephen, Jesus' disciple in Acts, speaks to the Jews about their forefathers' murdering of the prophets. Yet again, Origen states there is no mention of this in any other scripture, except, of course, in the apocryphal books of the good old Septuagint. One example from the Septuagint in the book of Susanna, which is within the book of Daniel, 2 Jewish elders are sentenced to death because of their plot to cover up their seeking out a young Hebrew wife, Susanna, in order to rape her. They accused her of adultery to hide their potential crime, and Daniel intervened and accused them. Do you honestly think it was a coincidence that this book was deemed uncanonical and therefore left out of the Old Testament entirely? Origen didn't, and he was a highly respected and well-known early church father. He even refers to our sneaky friends as rulers of Sodom, which is a reference to Isaiah chapter 1, verse 10. Origen then goes on to urge Christians to reject the newly redacted translation and remove all copies from their churches entirely. If only we had listened to our early Christian brethren and did the same today. Here is another video showing 50 Old Testament Bible verses from the Masoretic text that don't match up to the Septuagint and the New Testament quoters. For the sake of time, I will only go through some of them, but I encourage you to watch the video yourself, which I will list in the description. Here is Romans chapter 9, verse 29, which says, Lord of the Sabbath, in this verse. The Septuagint says the same here. However, the Masoretic text here says, Lord of hosts. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 8, Jesus clearly states that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. I don't think the Jews like that too much, so chop chop. In Luke chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, he quotes Isaiah chapter 40, where it says, Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be brought low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough ways shall be made smooth. And all flesh shall see the salvation of God. Once again, the Septuagint matches up with this verse. However, the Masoretic text says nothing about all flesh seeing the salvation of God. Instead, it says here, and all flesh shall see it together. Matthew chapter 12, verse 21. And in his name shall the Gentiles trust. This is a quote from Isaiah chapter 42. And in the Septuagint, it states the same here. However, the Masoretic text says something completely different here. And the isles shall wait for his law. This is one of many verses that our sneaky rabbi friends changed in order to take out any mention of the Gentiles in the Old Testament. Here is another example of that. Romans chapter 2, verse 24. Here Paul is quoting Isaiah 52. For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. And in the Septuagint, it states the same here. Paul's audience is the Jews. So was Isaiah's. So the you here is clearly the Jews. Well, here come our sneaky little friends again with their chop chop. Here is how the Masoretic text reads. And my name continually every day is blasphemed. No mention of the Gentiles here at all. I also want to point out something else in the previous verse here in the Septuagint, where it says, and ye shall not be ransomed with silver. In the Masoretic text here it says, and ye shall be redeemed without money. That is entirely different than the Septuagint. Also, verse 4 here in the Septuagint says, Thus saith the Lord, my people went down before to Egypt to sojourn there, and were carried away forcibly to the Assyrians. Compare this with the Masoretic text where it says here, and the Assyrians oppressed them without cause. What? Huh? That is an outright lie. Anyone who knows their Old Testament knows that the Israelites were taken away by the Assyrians because of their disobedience to God's commands. He had warned them time and again, and they refused to listen. So off they went. Sounds like our sneaky rabbis are at it once again. Here in Hebrews chapter 1, Paul is quoting Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 43. And again, when he bringeth in the first begotten into the world, he saith, and let all the angels of God worship him. Once again here, this verse matches up with the Septuagint. But in the Masoretic text, it is completely different. It states, Rejoice, O ye nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants. No mention of Jesus being worshipped by angels, and no mention of the Gentiles. Just a scribal error? I think not. So these are just some of the many examples of scripture that have been intentionally edited by the Jews. In my next video, I will show how our sneaky rabbi friends also gave God the Father several names like Yahweh and Jehovah, to name a few, when in the Septuagint, God never, ever had a proper name. And I will also show the reasoning behind this. Stay tuned, and God bless.
You can find the rest of her material at Elizabeth C. on YouTube at this channel.